For 57 years, one question haunted South Texas. How does a man escape justice when the police already know his name? This wasn't a mystery solved by DNA, it wasn't a forgotten fingerprint, and it wasn't a killer hiding somewhere beyond the law. The man detectives suspected lived in plain sight. He wore a Roman collar. He celebrated Mass, he heard confessions, and every week people placed their trust in him. His name was Father John Feit. Investigators believed he was the last person to see 25-year-old Irene Garza alive after she walked into Sacred Heart Church on Holy Saturday, 1960. 5 days later, her body was pulled from an irrigation canal. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and had been murdered. Police quickly focused on one suspect, yet no murder charge came. Days became months, months became years, years became decades. Witnesses died. Evidence gathered dust. The suspect grew old. Still, no one answered for Irene Garza's murder. Then, almost 6 decades later, everything changed. A forgotten letter surfaced. Hidden reports came to light. Former priests broke decades of silence, and a jury finally heard a story that investigators had been trying to piece together since Easter weekend in 1960. By the time it was over, the biggest mystery was no longer who killed Irene Garza. It was why it took 57 years to bring him to justice. This is the story of the confession, the cover-up, and the cold case that refused to stay buried. On this channel, we don't chase headlines. We uncover the investigations that history almost left behind. Using court records, witness testimony, archived newspapers, and original documents, we piece together what really happened, one clue at a time. If that's the kind of true crime documentary you enjoy, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Now, let's go back to the final evening of Irene Garza's life. Holy Saturday, April 16, 1960, McAllen, Texas. For Catholics across the city, Easter weekend was almost over. Churches were full. Families were preparing for Sunday morning. 25-year-old Irene Garza had one stop to make before going home. She told her parents she was going to Sacred Heart Church for confession. It was something she had done before. Nothing about that evening felt unusual. Irene was well known throughout the Rio Grande Valley. She had graduated from St. Joseph's Academy. She had earned a degree in education. She taught elementary school. Friends remembered her for her quiet faith and steady kindness. A year earlier, she'd been crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. She had plans for the future. By every account, her life was just beginning. She walked into Sacred Heart Church shortly before dusk. Inside, several priests were hearing confessions before Easter Sunday. One of them was 27-year-old Father John Bernard Feit. Years later, investigators would determine he was the last known person to see Irene alive. After entering the church, she disappeared. She never returned home. As the evening grew later, concern turned into panic. Her family called friends. Neighbors began looking. Police were notified. No one could explain how a woman had vanished after walking into one of the busiest churches in the city during Easter weekend. At first, it looked like a missing person case. It wouldn't stay that way for long. 5 days later, a farm worker made a discovery in an irrigation canal outside McAllen. Everything the community believed about Irene Garza's disappearance was about to change. 5 days. That's how long Irene Garza had been missing. By then, hope had started giving way to fear. Volunteers searched roads. Farmers checked irrigation ditches. Police followed every lead they received. None of them brought Irene home. Then, on the morning of April 21st, a farm worker spotted something floating in an irrigation canal outside McAllen. Deputies rushed to the scene. Within minutes, the search was over. Irene Garza had been found. The relief lasted only seconds. Her hands had been tied behind her back. A stocking had been forced deep into her throat. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been murdered before her body was thrown into the canal. The entire Rio Grande Valley was stunned. Just days earlier, Irene had been preparing for Easter. Now the community was preparing for her funeral. Investigators immediately began rebuilding her final hours. Where had she gone? Who had seen her? What was the last thing she did? Those questions produced one answer almost immediately. Everyone agreed Irene had gone to Sacred Heart Church for confession. Several priests had been hearing confessions that evening. One name appeared in interview after interview: Father John Feit. The young priest admitted Irene had entered his confessional. He told investigators she left after confession. If that was true, she disappeared within minutes of walking out of the church. Detectives checked every possibility. Did she leave with someone she knew? Was she abducted outside? Did she willingly get into a car? Nothing fit. Every timeline they built kept leading them back to the same place: Sacred Heart Church. The investigation had barely begun. Yet detectives already found themselves asking a question almost no one in McAllen wanted to ask. What if the last person to see Irene Garza alive was the man who heard her final confession? And once that question entered the investigation, it never disappeared. At first, Father John Feit didn't look like a murder suspect. He looked like exactly the kind of man people trusted. He was 27 years old, young, soft-spoken, recently ordained. For many families in McAllen, he represented faith, guidance, and moral certainty. No one expected detectives to be asking questions about him, yet that's exactly what happened. As investigators reconstructed Irene Garza's final hours, one fact never changed. She entered Sacred Heart Church. Father John Feit admitted hearing her confession. After that, no one could say with certainty where she went. The timeline kept collapsing into the same conclusion. If Irene disappeared within minutes of leaving the church, the last verified person to see her alive was the priest inside the confessional. Detectives interviewed Feit. He calmly answered their questions. He told them Irene finished her confession and left. There were no obvious inconsistencies. No physical evidence tied him to the murder. No eyewitness placed him with Irene outside the church. On paper, the investigation had reached a dead end. Then detectives learned something they hadn't known. Just weeks before Irene disappeared, another young woman had entered a Catholic church alone. Her name was Maria America Guerra. She never expected to become part of the same investigation. While praying inside the church, someone attacked her from behind. She fought back. She escaped. And when police asked who assaulted her, she gave them an answer almost impossible to believe: Father John Feit. Suddenly, this wasn't a single unexplained tragedy anymore. Investigators had two women, two churches, two violent encounters, and one name appearing in both. The question changed overnight. Police were no longer asking whether Father John Feit knew something about Irene Garza's disappearance. They were beginning to ask whether they had been looking at the killer from the very beginning. The next step seemed obvious. If detectives believed the same priest was connected to both attacks, an arrest had to be coming. Or so everyone thought. By the end of April 1960, many investigators believed they were closing in. The timeline pointed to one man. Another woman had accused the same priest of a violent attack. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Most people expected the next headline to be simple: priest arrested. It never came. Instead, John Feit remained free. The reason wasn't a lack of suspicion, it was a lack of proof. Investigators believed Irene had entered Father Feit's confessional. They believed he was the last confirmed person to see her alive. Belief wasn't enough. A courtroom demanded evidence. There was no eyewitness to Irene's murder, no confession, no forensic technology capable of answering the questions detectives desperately needed answered. The case stalled. Then, something unexpected happened. The investigation into Maria America Guerra moved first. Prosecutors charged Father Feit with assaulting the young college student inside a Catholic church. For Irene's family, it looked like the breakthrough they had been waiting for. If the assault case exposed what happened inside those church walls, the murder investigation might finally move forward. The trial began. Jurors listened, arguments were made, then nothing. The jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision. A mistrial was declared. Prosecutors faced a choice: try the case again or negotiate. They chose negotiation. Father John Feit agreed to plead no contest to a reduced misdemeanor charge. The felony disappeared. The punishment was a $500 fine, no prison sentence, no years behind bars. He walked out of court a free man. For many people in South Texas, the outcome made no sense. The only man connected to both Irene Garza and Maria America Guerra had avoided prison. Then he left the Rio Grande Valley. Years later, people would ask whether justice had simply failed, or whether someone had made sure it never had the chance. The answer wouldn't come from a courtroom, it would come from a document that was never supposed to become public. For years, people assumed the investigation had simply run out of evidence. That wasn't the whole story. Behind the scenes, another conversation had already begun. It wasn't happening inside a police station or a courtroom. It was happening inside the Catholic Church. Less than 4 months after Irene Garza's murder, church officials were already discussing Father John Feit's future. One letter would eventually become one of the most closely examined documents in the entire case. It was dated August 1, 1960. Written by Father Joseph Palicki, addressed to Father Lawrence Seidel, the provincial superior of the missionary oblates. On the surface, it looked like routine correspondence. The letter discussed the murder investigation. It referred to conversations with Sheriff E. Vickers. Then came a sentence prosecutors would later place before a jury. The sheriff concludes, "The longer time we have, the weaker the case gets." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was something else. An acknowledgement that time itself was becoming an ally. Then the letter shifted. Instead of discussing Irene Garza, it focused on Father Feit. Church leaders discussed moving him away from South Texas, away from the center of the investigation, away from what one letter described as the area of suspicion. The language was careful. There was no order to obstruct justice, no written plan to hide a murderer, nothing that direct. Yet one detail stood out. The woman who had lost her life was barely part of the conversation. The priest was. For decades, almost no one outside a small circle knew the letter existed. It remained buried while the investigation faded. When prosecutors finally introduced it during the 2017 murder trial, they argued it revealed something investigators had suspected for years. Not proof of murder, proof that protecting Father Feit's future had become a priority while Irene Garza's case grew colder. The defense strongly disagreed. They argued the letter proved nothing about murder. It contained no confession, no admission, no conspiracy. The jury would decide what weight it deserved. Still, the document left one question hanging over the entire case. If church officials were already discussing how to move Father Feit away from the area of suspicion just months after Irene's death, what else existed that the public had never been allowed to see? The answer was waiting inside another forgotten file. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was 4 confidential examinations that told a very different story. By the mid-1960s, the investigation had lost momentum. The prime suspect was gone. The murder remained unsolved. For most people, that was the end of the story. Behind closed doors, another investigation continued. One almost no one knew existed. For decades, people repeated the same claim. Father John Feit had taken a lie detector test. He passed. The rumor spread so widely that many accepted it as fact. If the prime suspect had passed a polygraph, perhaps investigators had simply suspected the wrong man. That belief survived for years. The reports themselves told a different story. When the case was reopened decades later, investigators recovered confidential records from John E. Reed and Associates, one of the country's best-known polygraph firms. They discovered Father Feit hadn't taken 1 examination, he had taken 4. The examiner didn't conclude he was truthful. He reached the opposite conclusion. The reports described Father Feit as highly deceptive. According to the examiner, he repeatedly showed signs of attempting to manipulate the examination through controlled breathing and evasive responses. Then came a statement investigators never forgot. According to the examiner's notes, Father Feit said, "There won't be any more evidence that comes out, and what you have isn't enough to convict me." It wasn't a confession, it was something almost as unsettling, a statement that seemed to acknowledge exactly how fragile the investigation had become. Father Feit offered an explanation. He claimed the deceptive results weren't caused by guilt. He said the real killer had confessed the crime to him. As a priest, he argued, knowing those details affected the examination. The examiner wasn't convinced. Neither were investigators. The reports remained confidential. The public never saw them. The jury investigating Irene Garza's murder never heard them. The documents disappeared into storage for decades. When prosecutors finally reopened the case, the reports resurfaced. The defense immediately fought to keep any mention of them away from the jury. Texas courts don't recognize polygraph results as evidence of guilt. The reports would never prove murder. That wasn't their value. Their value was something else. For decades, the public believed Father Feit had been cleared. The confidential records suggested investigators had reached a very different conclusion. Once again, the public story and the private investigation weren't telling the same story, and those hidden reports led investigators to someone who had remained silent for more than 40 years. A priest who claimed John Feit had finally told him the truth. By the early 2000s, the Irene Garza investigation had been cold for more than 40 years. Most people believed there was nothing left to find. No new witnesses, no new evidence, no new leads. Then the phone rang. It wasn't a detective. It wasn't a prosecutor. A former monk named Dale Tacheni. He told Texas Rangers he had been carrying a secret for decades. At first, investigators weren't even sure his story belonged to the Irene Garza case. Tacheni said that years earlier, while living in a monastery, another priest had privately admitted killing a young woman during Easter weekend. The details were vague, the location wasn't. As Rangers compared his account with the old case file, the pieces began to fit. The priest Tacheni was describing was Father John Feit. It was the first crack in the wall. Then investigators found someone else, Father Joseph O'Brien. In 1960, O'Brien had served alongside John Feit at Sacred Heart Church. He knew him, worked beside him, saw him every day. For years, he had said nothing publicly. When Texas Rangers finally interviewed him, he described something he had never forgotten. The morning after Irene disappeared, he noticed fresh scratches covering Father Feit's hands and arms. At the time, he thought little of it. Years later, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Then came the moment investigators had been searching for since 1960. O'Brien said Father Feit eventually admitted killing Irene Garza, not in a courtroom, not in a police interview, in a private conversation between two priests. According to O'Brien, Feit confessed that Irene had died during an assault inside the church. For decades, that confession stayed hidden. O'Brien never testified. He died before the murder trial began. His words almost disappeared with him. Except they didn't. Years earlier, investigative journalist Brooks Egerton had interviewed O'Brien while researching the case. He kept detailed notes. When the murder trial finally began in 2017, those notes became evidence. For the first time, a jury heard what O'Brien claimed Father Feit had told him decades earlier. The defense challenged everything. There was no recording, no written confession signed by Father Feit. O'Brien wasn't alive to answer questions. The jury would have to decide how much weight to give a confession preserved only through witness testimony and investigative notes. Even so, the investigation had changed forever. For decades, detectives suspected Father Feit. Now they had multiple people claiming he had admitted the crime. The question was no longer whether investigators had enough to reopen the case. The question was why. By 2004, the investigation had everything it had never had before. A former monk, a fellow priest, a confidential church letter, hidden investigative records. For Irene Garza's family, it finally felt like the case was moving. Then it stopped. Again. District Attorney Irene Garza presented the case to a grand jury. The family waited. So did the investigators. When the decision came back, there was no indictment. John Feit remained free. For many families, that would have been the end. For Irene's family, it became another beginning. Her cousins Noemi Ponce Sigler and Linda de la Vigna refused to let the investigation disappear. They weren't detectives, they weren't prosecutors, they had no power to issue subpoenas, no authority to arrest anyone. What they had was persistence. Year after year, they spoke with reporters, met investigators, collected documents, asked questions, and every time the case slipped back into silence, they pulled it into the light again. As the years passed, the fight became about more than solving a murder. It became about keeping Irene's name alive. New district attorneys came and went. Police chiefs retired. Texas Rangers changed. The family stayed. Then something happened that changed the investigation in a way no one expected. The case entered politics. During Hidalgo County's 2014 district attorney election, Irene Garza's murder became a campaign issue. Critics questioned why the case had never reached trial, why no indictment had been secured, why so many years had passed without justice. When Ricardo Rodriguez Jr. was elected district attorney, the investigation changed almost immediately. Boxes of evidence came off storage shelves. Old witness statements were reviewed. Texas Rangers returned to people who had spoken decades earlier. Investigators weren't looking for a new suspect. They were asking whether the evidence had finally reached the point where a jury could hear it. For the first time in more than half a century, the answer appeared to be yes. On February 9, 2016, police officers arrived at a quiet home in Scottsdale, Arizona. An 83-year-old retired priest answered the door. After 57 years, John Feit was finally under arrest. The real battle was only beginning. February 9, 2016, Scottsdale, Arizona. For more than half a century, John Feit had lived as a free man. He had grown old, retired, built a quiet life far from South Texas. Then, early that morning, police knocked on his front door. The 83-year-old former priest was placed under arrest for the murder of Irene Garza. 57 years after detectives first suspected him, he was finally heading back to Texas. The arrest made national headlines. For Irene's family, it was a moment they had imagined for decades. It wasn't justice. An arrest proves only one thing, that prosecutors believe they have enough evidence to stand before a jury. Now they had to prove it. That would be the hardest part of all. There was no DNA linking Father Feit to the murder, no surveillance cameras, no fingerprints that could answer the case. Most of the detectives who originally investigated Irene's death were gone. Several key witnesses had died. Even the crime scene itself belonged to another era. The prosecution faced a question every cold case investigator eventually confronts. How do you prove a murder after 57 years? Their answer wasn't one piece of evidence. It was dozens. The church letter, the confidential investigative files, the testimony of former monks, the recollections of fellow priests, the timeline, the assault on Maria America Guerra. Individually, each piece raised questions. Together, prosecutors argued they told one consistent story. The defense saw it differently. They argued the state had built its case on memories that had faded over decades, witnesses who could no longer be questioned, documents open to interpretation, assumptions replacing proof. The jury would have to decide which version of the story they believed. In November 2017, the trial finally began. For the first time, John Feit sat inside a courtroom, facing a jury accused of murdering Irene Garza. Everything investigators had gathered over 57 years was about to be tested, not by detectives, not by reporters, by 12 ordinary citizens sworn to decide whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. November 2017, 57 years after Irene Garza disappeared, the case finally reached a jury. John Feit walked into the Hidalgo County courtroom as an 85-year-old former priest. For the first time in his life, he stood trial for Irene Garza's murder. The prosecution knew this wouldn't be an ordinary murder trial. There was no eyewitness to the killing, no DNA, no video, no fingerprint that could answer the central question. Instead, they asked the jury to look at the entire picture, one piece at a time. The state began rebuilding Easter weekend, 1960. Jurors heard about Irene's final confession, the attack on Maria America Guerra, the church letter discussing Father Feit's removal from the area of suspicion, the hidden investigative records, the confidential polygraph reports. Each witness added another piece. Each document filled another gap. Individually, none of them proved murder. Together, prosecutors argued they pointed to only one conclusion. Then the jury heard from Dale Tacheny. More than 50 years earlier, he had lived inside a Missouri monastery with John Feit. He testified that Feit eventually admitted what happened to Irene Garza. According to Tacheny, Feit described placing Irene in a bathtub after the assault. As he walked away, he heard her struggling to breathe. When he returned, she was dead. The courtroom fell silent. The prosecution wasn't finished. Investigative journalist Brooks Egerton took the stand. Years before Father Joseph O'Brien died, Egerton had interviewed him and carefully preserved his notes. Those notes described another confession, another priest, another account pointing to the same man. The defense challenged the testimony immediately. O'Brien wasn't alive. His statements couldn't be tested through cross-examination. The jury would have to decide how much weight they deserved. Throughout the trial, the defense reminded jurors of one simple fact. Every confession they had heard came through someone else. There was no recording, no signed statement, no direct admission inside the courtroom. The prosecution agreed. This wasn't a case built on one confession. It was built on decades of evidence that, they argued, all pointed in the same direction. By the time closing arguments ended, the courtroom wasn't asking whether Irene Garza had been murdered. That had never been in dispute. The only question left was whether 57 years of evidence had finally answered who was responsible. 12 jurors disappeared behind a closed door. For the first time since Easter weekend, 1960, the answer belonged to them. The jury didn't deliberate for weeks. They didn't ask for months of testimony to be read back. After hearing evidence gathered across nearly 6 decades, they reached a decision. On December 8, 2017, the courtroom filled once again. Irene Garza's family sat together. So did John Feit. No one spoke as the jury filed into the room. The foreperson stood. The judge asked for the verdict. Guilty. After 57 years, the man investigators had suspected almost from the beginning was convicted of murdering Irene Garza. The verdict marked the end of one of the longest-running murder investigations in Texas history. But it wasn't built on a single piece of evidence. It wasn't built on DNA, or fingerprints, or one dramatic confession. It was built the same way the investigation had unfolded, one piece at a time, a timeline that never changed, a survivor who identified the same priest, a letter that raised difficult questions, hidden investigative records, former monks, a fellow priest, a family that refused to stop asking questions. Each piece carried weight. Together, the jury decided they proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The next day, John Feit returned to court for sentencing. He was 85 years old. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. For Irene's family, the words brought relief. Not because they erased the past. Nothing could do that. Her parents had died before hearing the verdict. Many detectives who had worked the original investigation never lived to see the trial. Some of the witnesses whose testimony helped convict Feit were gone as well. Justice had finally arrived. Time never did. As deputies led John Feit from the courtroom, one question still lingered. How had a case with so many warning signs remained unresolved for more than half a century? The answer wasn't found in the verdict. It was found in everything that happened before it, and it became Irene Garza's lasting legacy. John Feit appealed his conviction. He argued the evidence was too old. The witnesses were unreliable. The testimony should never have reached the jury. The courts rejected those arguments. His conviction stood. In February 2020, John Bernard Feit died in prison. He was 87 years old. The legal case was over. The story wasn't. For decades, people described the Irene Garza investigation as a cold case. That was never entirely true. Cold cases are forgotten. Irene Garza never was. Every few years, someone asked another question. A reporter, a Texas Ranger, a family member, a former priest, a witness who had stayed silent for decades. Each question uncovered another piece of the story. Not enough to solve the case, enough to keep it alive. In the end, justice didn't arrive because of one miracle discovery. It arrived because dozens of ordinary people refused to let the investigation disappear. Some collected documents, some protected old evidence, some finally spoke after years of silence, some simply refused to stop asking why. One decision led to another, one document led to another, one witness led to another. Until the picture became impossible to ignore, the Irene Garza case became something larger than one murder investigation. It became a lesson in how institutions are tested, how families endure, how memories survive, and how time doesn't always defeat justice. 57 years earlier, a 25-year-old school teacher walked into Sacred Heart Church expecting to spend a few quiet minutes in confession. She never came home. The man accused of taking her life spent decades believing the case would never reach a courtroom. In the end, it did. Not because the evidence suddenly appeared, because people refused to stop looking. Sometimes, justice arrives quickly. Sometimes, it takes a lifetime. For Irene Garza, it took 57 years. But when the verdict was finally read, her story became more than a cold case. It became proof that the truth has a way of waiting, and eventually, of being heard. For Irene Garza, justice came 57 years late. For her family, it meant the truth would never again be dismissed as rumor. For South Texas, it became a reminder that some investigations never truly end. They wait. Sometimes for new evidence, sometimes for one witness to speak, sometimes for someone willing to ask one more question. Because cold cases aren't solved by time. They're solved by people who refuse to let the truth disappear. If you believe stories like Irene's deserve to be remembered, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries, and share this investigation with someone who appreciates the pursuit of justice. And if this case left an impression on you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.